The noon sun glared down on Clearwater Ridge, a frontier town carved out of dust, sweat, and the hard bargains of desperate men. Mary Whitlock staggered through the dirt street, her breath ragged, her hair falling loose from its braid as she clutched an old, crumpled promissory note, the one thing that had destroyed her life in a single morning. Only hours ago, she had been baking bread and humming lullabies to her baby boy, Eli, unaware that dark boots were already marching toward her cabin. When Sheriff Carver and two hired men tore the door off its hinges, she stood frozen, flour still on her fingers, staring at the badge pinned to the coldest man in the territory. "Widow Whitlock," he announced, reading the name like an accusation. "Your late husband died owing the town a debt he never paid," she tried to explain. She had no money, no land, no crops after last winter's freeze. But the sheriff only stared through her as if she were already a ghost. Then came the words that hollowed out her ribs. "So by council decree, your baby is hereby seized as payment for the debt." Before she could scream, the two men had snatched the crying bundle from her arms, wrapping him in a rough wool blanket as though he were property. She clawed, begged, fell to her knees. But they dragged him out the door, leaving her sobbing on the floor with her hands, reaching for a child she could still hear but couldn't hold. Now she stumbled behind them through Clearwater's main street, covered in dust and shaking uncontrollably as the townsfolk watched, some pitying, some turning away, some tightening their lips in silent fear of the sheriff's wrath. In the distance, the courthouse loomed like a gallows. "Please!" Mary screamed, her voice cracking as the men pushed the baby's wooden cradle on wheels toward the steps. "Please. He's all I have left." But the sheriff didn't slow. He didn't see a mother. He saw an opportunity. The baby wasn't just payment. He was leverage, a pawn in a political game Mary didn't understand. Her tears smeared down her face as she crawled after them, her hands scraping bloody trails in the dirt. The crowd parted, everyone, except one stranger leaning against a hitching post. Tall, broad-shouldered, a mountain of a man, with scars mapped across his arms and a leather vest open at the chest. His eyes shadowed under a low-brim hat, locked onto Mary's trembling figure, then to the cradle being pushed up the courthouse steps. Something in his expression shifted, a quiet fury flickering like a storm rolling over the peaks. His horse snorted behind him, sensing his change. Whispers swept the crowd. "Isn't that?" "No, it couldn't be." Some stepped back as the man peeled himself off the post and started walking, slow, steady, each step pounding the dirt like thunder. Sheriff Carver's men didn't notice until Mary screamed again as the cradle jolted hard on a bump. The sheriff turned, ready to tell her to shut her mouth, but froze when he saw the stranger. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. Mountain men were rare in Clearwater, men who lived alone in the brutal heights of the Rockies, surviving what would kill 10 ordinary men: bears, blizzards, outlaws. This one was known by a name spoken only in uneasy whispers. "Bran of the North Ridge," a man said to have broken a band of marauders with his bare hands. A man with no patience for injustice, and for reasons Mary couldn't understand, he was walking directly toward her child. Sheriff Carver stiffened, forcing a smug smile. "Just passing through, Bran?" he asked, pretending not to be intimidated. But Bran's gaze wasn't on him. It was fixed on the crying child in the cradle. The moment he reached Mary, he knelt and gently lifted her chin with calloused fingers, his voice low and steady. "Whose baby?" "Mine," she whispered through sobs. "They're taking him. They said he's payment." "Please, please help." Bran stood, turning his towering height toward the sheriff with a presence so fierce. The crowd collectively stepped back. "You take a child," Bran said, his voice deep as rolling thunder, "and you call it debt?" The sheriff squared his shoulders. "It's the law." "No," Bran growled, walking closer. "It's your law." The sheriff's men shifted uneasily. No one dared raise a gun, not yet. The wind kicked up dust, swirling between the men like a warning. Mary held her breath, clutching the dirt, praying for a miracle. And then, in one fluid motion, Bran placed a massive hand on the cradle's wooden rail. The sheriff's eyes widened. His men reached for their holsters. The bystanders gasped. A storm was about to break over Clearwater Ridge, and everyone knew it. At high noon, with the mountains watching over them like ancient judges, the fate of a mother and her child, balanced on a single heartbeat, held now in the hands of a mountain man who had no fear of any law but his own. The moment Brand's hand tightened on the cradle, the air itself seemed to tremble. Sheriff Carver's eyes flicked from Brand's grip to the baby's terrified face, then to the crowd gathering in a wide circle around them. Every man who had ever bullied a widow, overcharged a farmer, or taken a bribe suddenly, realized he was standing before a predator who didn't recognize their authority and wouldn't hesitate to crush anyone who threatened the child. "Step back," the sheriff barked, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear creeping up his spine. Brand didn't move. "You bring a council's decree?" he asked softly, dangerously. Carver straightened. "The Whitlock debt is legal, binding, and the child is now rightful property of the town until repayment is met." A murmur of disgust rippled across the bystanders. Even those too afraid to speak had never felt right about that law. Brand's jaw clenched. "A child," he repeated, "is not payment." Carver motioned to his men. "Take him," the two coat-wearing enforcers lunged forward, but they were far too slow. Brand's fist shot out like lightning, slamming into the first man's chest so hard he flew backward into a horse trough, sending water splashing across the street. Before the second man could draw his gun, Brand kicked the cradle toward Mary, sending it rolling gently to her feet as he pivoted and snatched the outlaw's wrist, twisting until the gun clattered onto the ground. A moment later, the man was face down in the dirt, groaning. The crowd erupted, not with chaos but with energy, as though the entire town had just woken from a long, suffocating sleep. Mary scrambled to the cradle, wrapping her arms around her baby, sobbing with relief as Eli whimpered softly, "Safe again." But the danger wasn't over. Sheriff Carver's face turned bright red as he reached for his own revolver. "Enough!" he shouted. "This town is mine, and no mountain brute is going to—" He never finished. Brand's gaze cut to him, cold and wild like a wolf defending its pack. "Draw that gun," Brand said, "and you won't get to fire it." The sheriff hesitated, his grip trembling. He wasn't a coward, but he had never faced a force like this, a man who wasn't just strong, but who carried a conviction deeper than any badge or law book. The crowd murmured again. People who once bowed their heads now raised them. Farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, every person whom Carver had overpowered for years, watched the showdown with a flicker of hope in their eyes. "This is my town," Carver repeated, but this time it sounded weak. Brand stepped forward, closing the distance until only a few feet separated them. "It was your town," Brand said, "until you decided to sell mothers and children like cattle." The sheriff sputtered. "I uphold the law." "No," Brand corrected. "You hide behind it." The silence that fell was heavy, suffocating. Carver swallowed hard and slowly lowered his gun. For the first time in years, he realized he had lost, not only to one man, but to the truth that his cruelty had been witnessed by everyone. Brand tilted his head toward the courthouse. "Tear down the decree," he ordered. "End the debt law, today." The sheriff looked around at the crowd, men and women no longer afraid of him. Even the council members standing on the courthouse steps shifted uncomfortably. They knew that if the town chose to side with Brand, Carver would be powerless. After a long, trembling moment, the sheriff nodded. "Fine," he muttered. "The law is revoked. The child stays with his mother." Relief crashed over Mary like a flood. Tears streamed down her face as she raised her baby high against her chest. Whispering thanks into Eli's hair, the crowd erupted in applause, cheers of freedom, of justice, of a weight lifted from their hearts. Brand didn't bask in the praise. He simply walked to Mary, kneeling beside her as the cheers swelled around them. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Mary reached for his hand, trembling. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. He gave a small half-smile. "Don't need thanks. Just needed to make things right." But the way he looked at Mary, gently, protectively, made her chest tighten with something she hadn't felt since before her husband died. Safety, possibility, hope. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Brand helped her to her feet, lifting the cradle with one hand as though it weighed nothing. The town gathered around them, offering help, food, work, people who had once been silent, now eager to stand with a woman who had nearly lost everything. Sheriff Carver, defeated, slunk away into the shadows. Order would return, but not his order, not anymore. Mary stood beside Brand as the last light of day washed over the dusty street, her baby asleep in her arms. "Will you stay in Clearwater?" she asked softly. Bran glanced toward the mountains, then to her, his expression softer than anyone had ever seen on a man like him. Maybe, he said. Got a feeling this place might need me. Mary smiled through her tears, holding Eli close. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt a future unfolding, one where her son grew up free, not as property, one where justice didn't depend on fear, but on courage, one where a mountain man who rode into town at noon might one day call it home. And as the screen fades on this moment of triumph and hope, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Stories of courage, justice, and the unstoppable strength of the human spirit. Your support helps us bring the next chapter to life. Subscribe now and join our growing family of storytellers.